It was a privilege to be cursed, a curse to be so privileged. The soul was afflicted with an extraordinary condition. Ordinarily, when a body dies, the soul persists and finds refuge in a new host decades or even centuries later. Ordinarily, memories fade with the body. In the case of this particular soul, the host was forced to remember each of its previous lives in vividly excruciating detail. A sort of immortality was gained in this way. As long as humanity survived, so too would the memories of the cursed soul. The soul first opened its eyes in an age of kings and queens, an age of castles and the vast armies sworn to defend them. The soul found itself lowborn and yearning for destiny to take hold of a life otherwise consigned to insignificance. In this life, the soul was called Laria, a young woman set on the path of knighthood, seemingly the only path out of obscurity. Laria's spirit was not only one of boundless ambition, but also of unbreaking perseverance, and she soon found her services in great demand. She had the marksmanship to separate a man from his hat 100 feet away, and the swordsmanship to separate any man from his head from a much shorter distance. It was no wonder that she was soon called upon by the royal family of Castile to serve in the royal guard. This was a position she couldn't refuse, both for the esteem the position afforded and to see for herself the majesty held within the walls of a castle she'd only been able to glimpse from afar. When life is mundane, such a magnificent sight as a castle, with looming towers, sprawling gardens, and shiny armored knights, draws a good deal of curiosity. Young girls and boys spend years wondering about what mysteries and wonders the walls must hold, and Laria was no different. She was to be disappointed, however, as the imaginings of a child trump reality handily. The castle was certainly grand, but also barren and drab, like art with no soul. Worse was the job Laria was assigned to fill as the personal guard to the dynasty's only son and sole heir, Prince Amadeo. The task was dreadfully boring, lacking adventure of any sort. Prince Amadeo was a frail young man and seldom left the confines of his room, let alone the castle walls. As a result, Laria spent her time outside his door, silently guarding him from dangers that would never appear. It wasn't long before she began to feel as though she wasn't living up to her potential. Prestigious as the position was, who would remember her for standing beside a door all day? She had nothing against the prince himself. He was always kind, both to her and the house's servants. He studied passionately and rigorously tended to the few affairs his parents would allow him. They were endlessly protective over him, given both his sickly nature and his role as the only suitable heir. Laria wondered if Amadeo felt as though his potential were being squandered as she did. He was nearly in a position to change the world, yet he was being firmly held back by those around him. Despite appearances, Laria would soon find that the young prince wasn't quite as hindered as she'd believed. One day, while leaning up against the wall beside Amadeo's door, on a particularly stormy day, she heard a loud thud from inside his room. She received no answer upon knocking, so she entered, sword drawn and adrenaline flowing. There were no foes to conquer in the large room, yet there was no prince to protect either. The window on the far side was unlocked and currently swinging around in the wind. It must have been the window smacking into the wall that she'd heard earlier. More pressing than the source of the noise, however, was the novel revelation that the prince, who she was to be watching over, was not accounted for. Laria rushed to the window and quickly pieced together how he'd made his escape. There was a large oak tree next to the window, complete with numerous branches for an easy descent. Laria thought for a moment that it would be best to tell the other guards about the issue, but she ultimately decided against it. They would turn the city upside down looking for the prince, and she suspected he would be back of his own accord. Foul play was unlikely, as the castle grounds themselves were thoroughly defended, and there had been no signs of a struggle in the room. Furthermore, this was not an opportunity Lauria intended to share. Even for just a day, a trip out into the city seemed much more entertaining than what she'd become accustomed to. Lauria climbed deftly to the ground and quickly found the prince's footprints in the muddy lawn. For a skilled tracker such as herself, it was a trifle to follow the tracks to the neighboring city. The trail was slightly fainter here, but Lauria kept up the hunt and soon came to the slums of the 7th Quarter, where the tracks were replaced by a hooded figure carrying a large pack with what seemed to be great effort. She watched from afar as the figure trudged through the rain, moving from house to house, provided you could really call these shacks houses. The figure, who could easily be ascertained to be Amadeo, would enter the houses for a minute or so before leaving to go to the next. Lauria followed him around for nearly 20 minutes until she became quite sure she knew what he was up to. To confirm her theory, she crept to the window of a house he just left and carefully peered in. As she had suspected, the family seemed to have recently acquired a care package of food, including bread, vegetables, and a small cut of meat. How Amadeo had made off with so much food from the kitchens was a mystery to Lauria, but she couldn't help but feel impressed. Amadeo, sheltered and weak, was able to rebel in his own way and try to make a difference for these people. He didn't want recognition or power. He only wanted the people around him to live more comfortably, if only by a little. The next day, Lauria was shocked to find her routine seemed somehow less boring. Suddenly, the prince seemed much more regal, with his kind yet intelligent hazel eyes and his genuine smile that effortlessly put others at ease. She listened intently at her post today and was finally rewarded by the sound of the window latch around noon. Thus began her next few months of following the prince through the city. She stayed distant enough to remain undetected, but close enough to keep an eye on him. In all truth, she couldn't seem to keep her eyes off of the young royal. From breakfast to bed, her eyes wandered to his, though she couldn't help but look away when he inevitably took notice and smiled sweetly back at her. During his days out on the town, Amadeo handed out food and clothes, helped with chores, and entertained children, all with that beautiful grin of his. No one had the faintest idea of his true identity, and he seemed happier for it. It wasn't long before Lauria found herself relishing the role as Amadeo's personal guard. She couldn't think of a more noble thing than to defend such a pure soul as the prince's. Whether or not the position gained her recognition, she decided this was the way she would spend her life for years to come. These years, unfortunately, were not guaranteed. On a fateful evening, as the sun began to set beneath the line of trees and buildings, Amadeo had set out with an oversized bundle of toys. Tomorrow was to be a major festival, after all, and he wanted parents in the 7th Quarter to be able to give their children gifts for the occasion, even if they couldn't afford it. For all her training and ability, Lauria didn't notice anything was amiss until it was much too late. She would forever regret this moment, wondering if she might have done something if only she'd been more focused, better disciplined. As it was, she could do nothing but watch in anguish as the heavy shaft of an arrow sprouted in her prince's gut. Her training kept her sharp, and it wasn't long before she located the enemy. 5 assassins dressed in black cloaks, hidden in an alley just across the street from the young prince. The odds were against her. These were obviously no basic foot soldiers, but she drew her sword and charged nonetheless. She cut through the first 3 as if they were made of straw, so quickly that they didn't have time to react, but their deaths bought the remaining 2 aggressors some breathing room. The first lunged at her with a long knife, slashing through the flesh on her upper arm. Lauria grimaced, but didn't falter, and he was cut down as well. The 5th assassin was upon her moments after, and his knife was aimed higher. She couldn't dodge. She felt her skin tear as the knife swiped across her throat, causing pain like nothing she'd ever experienced. She dropped to one knee, bloodied and losing her grip on her weapon and her consciousness. She could not allow herself to fall. She was unafraid of death's clutches. She knew it was inevitable now. But if she fell, what would become of the prince? She'd sworn to protect him. No other goal was as worthy, and she would gladly die for it. Before that, however, she would need to fight for it. With Herculean effort, she swung her sword in a powerful arc, and the last assassin fell. Laria's world began to spin. She could feel herself fading. Only her worry for Amadeo's safety kept her alive as she crawled over to where he lay sprawled on the ground. When at last she was beside him, her body was already numb to life's pain, and she saw the truth of her failure. She looked down at the prince, and he looked back up at her. He had not yet faded, but blood pooled beneath him, and she could tell from his expression that he knew his time was up. For a moment, his eyes widened at the sight of her, shocked that she was even there. Then he gave her that damned smile, as if to reassure her that everything would be fine. It was a sweet lie, and the last he'd tell as his life slipped from him with a final sigh. Laria herself followed soon after, dying with full knowledge of her failure and regret. Perhaps this regret was why the soul's memory would continue to persist through the years, or maybe the phenomenon was the result of a stronger feeling, had such a thing been possible. Regardless, Laria's memories were retained, and in each new body her soul inhabited, the pain of her failure was alive and fresh. In her very next life, she would meet Amadeo again, reincarnated as a new host, but much the same as he was in his previous life. This trend would continue, and through fate or circumstance, her path always seemed to cross with his. She didn't know how she knew it was him, but she could always feel it, without a doubt in her mind. In every life, she watched over him from afar, and as she had when she was a knight. And in every life, whether through fate or circumstance, Amadeo died at much too young an age, and Laria found herself unable to save him. She was doomed to repeat her failure, over and over, reliving her greatest tragedy in a nightmarish cycle of reincarnation. So it isn't surprising that in her most recent life she was weary and depressed, having all but forsaken the idea that she'd ever be able to save her dearest ward. In this life, Laria was called Darren, and had yet to meet Amadeo's newest incarnation. Darren had no doubt that he would, however. The thought only brought him despair. History was doomed to repeat itself, and he could hardly bear to watch Amadeo die again. On the day that he would meet his fated companion, Darren was at the mall. He would be heading off to college soon and needed to collect some supplies before he left. He was an efficient shopper, and he was soon leaving the stationery store with 2 bags of journals and utensils. Darren started to make for the exit when the sound of a piano stopped him dead in his tracks. The melody was familiar. He was certain he'd heard it, though he wasn't sure which life he'd heard it in. Almost unconsciously, he followed the sound of the music to the middle of the food court, where a group of kids was gathered around an old, germ-ridden display piano. On the bench was a young woman with piercing brown eyes and curly hair that fell to her shoulders. She was fully engrossed in her performance and would occasionally look over the top of the piano to flash the watching children and their parents a cheerful grin. Darren's heart sank as he knew the instant he saw her that this was Amadeo's most recent incarnation. It made him sick to think that a young woman this full of life was fated to die young, and he couldn't help but blame himself. Still, he inconspicuously watched from a table in the food court as she played, clinging half-heartedly to the idea that maybe this time things would be different. He didn't truly believe this. How could he? But the sentiment was all that carried him forward. She must have played for hours as people came and went from the mall, many stopping to enjoy her music. She didn't stand to leave until it was late, and the mall was beginning to empty. Darren got up to leave as well. He did have to get home after all, or his parents would worry about him. He didn't doubt that he'd encounter the woman again soon. However, as he gathered his bags to leave, he realized the woman was approaching him. He thought it must be a coincidence. Maybe she was walking in this direction for some other reason, though he couldn't reasonably think of what, given that he was sequestered away in an empty corner. She stopped in front of him and smiled the smile that seemed insistent on doubling his heart rate. "Did you like my playing?" she asked. "What?" Darren replied dumbly, still much too focused on the smile. "Well, you've been watching me play for so long, I thought maybe it was because you enjoyed listening to me play." Darren cursed himself for being so obvious. Of course she would notice him. Why had he sat here for so long? It was almost as though he'd been unable to leave. He'd certainly enjoyed her music, anyhow. "I thought your playing was incredible," he said. "I really was entranced by it." Her smile widened, and Darren's heart nearly seized. "I'm glad you liked it." She shifted, seemingly unsure about what she'd say next. "This may seem strange, but I'm sure we've met before." Darren tried to keep his expression neutral, but the question shocked him. Did she remember something? This wasn't supposed to happen. "No," he said after a moment. "I believe this is the first time we've met." The girl shrugged. "Well, my name is Sarah. You are Darren," he finished. "Okay, Darren. Again, this might seem weird, but would you like to maybe go out sometime? I don't know what it is, but I feel some sort of connection to you somehow. As stupid as that sounds, I don't want to just let it go. It feels important somehow." Now, Darren was truly shocked. This was almost... Now, Darren was truly shocked. This was already more than he'd ever interacted with one of Amadeo's reincarnations. He was supposed to watch, to protect. He had no place in Sarah's life. But as he looked into her eyes, which Now, Darren was truly shocked. This was already more than he'd ever interacted with one of Amadeo's reincarnations. He was supposed to watch, to protect. He had no place in Sarah's life. But as he looked into her eyes, Now, Darren was truly shocked. This was already more than he'd ever interacted with one of Amadeo's reincarnations. He was supposed to watch, to protect. He had no place in Sarah's life. But as he looked into her eyes, which seemed simultaneously hopeful and curious, he found himself unable to refuse. Sarah wasn't smiling now, instead looking at him with an expression of anxious anticipation. He wanted to see her smile again. "I would be happy to," he replied, his voice wavering just a little. Sarah's face erupted in a relieved grin, and Darren felt in that moment he couldn't possibly regret his choice. This time would be different. He would not fail. For once, he was thankful that he could remember his past lives. This was a moment he didn't want to forget.